Welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prashanth, for really doing this and helping celebrate our 1 year anniversary. There's so much to learn from Stack Overflow. I mean, you built one of the largest, what we call watering holes for developers, almost 100 million developers. And we'd love to learn about community building and more. So, really appreciate you coming over.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dheeraj. And big fan of what you've done in your career, and it's a privilege to be part of your new story with DevRev. So it sounds like a phenomenal mission, and we're happy to share whatever's helpful to you folks.
Absolutely. So maybe you can start with that observation: 100 million community members in probably the last decade, I would assume. Um, what were some of the lessons that you went through from zero to one of the largest developer communities in the world?
Yeah, there's a lot that we've learned. And, I came on board as a CEO 2 years ago in 2019, after many years at Rackspace. I was mostly focused on the cloud world, and happy to talk about that journey as well. But in general, as I sort of came on board, all the teams that I'd led historically, and even at Rackspace, have used Stack Overflow so deeply, right? So every engineer clearly uses it, every developer, technologist in the world. And it started out as purely a Q&A platform to democratize access to a lot of the fundamental technical knowledge that we should all have access to, right? So as a former developer myself, and I can empathize with the fact that writing code can be very frustrating. At least it used to be back in the day. And the whole point of founders Joel Spolsky and Jeff Atwood creating this platform was, let's just make sure that the shared DNA of helping fellow developers is really what the driving force is, and that was really to enable people to be able to very freely give people access to information that mattered. So our learnings, in summary, I would say are, I would probably summarize it into 5 points. The first one is, I think, focusing on a very large shared identity and sort of big problem that you're trying to solve. In this particular case for Stack, it had to do with the fact that people want to have access to answers to problems that they were getting stuck on. Number two, creating real incentives and rewarding users to be part of that community, which I think is very important. And in our case, we've done, obviously, with our platform, a lot of the gamification and the upvotes and the downvotes and badges and recognition for people that are great at what they do as they help their fellow community members. The third one is building with the community versus for the community, right? There's a distinction there between, forcing something on somebody to follow versus saying this is being created by the community and you're there as more of a shepherd to help them actually sort of, accelerate that progress. And that's something that, I think that's probably the one that's probably the most interesting one that we have to grapple with, because there's always a little bit of a push and pull there. And then probably the fourth one is, breaking down silos and really building bridges across various technology groups, because the world is sort of converging very rapidly, right? So that's cloud or data or scripting languages, and the lines are blurring on what a DevOps engineer does or what a full stack developer does. And so giving them access to not only knowledge, but individuals and fellow developers who are approaching the problem from a slightly different vantage point is also super critical. And finally, I would say is just creating those virtuous cycles, so it's sort of the network feeds the network, and so that this keeps going forward. So those are probably the 5 big things I would mention as sort of our macro learnings, Dheeraj. And one other point I just mentioned is, we at Stack started with the community, built a great brand out of it, and now we're actually on a product-led journey. Part of the reason why I'm on board as a CEO. And most companies take the opposite route, right? They start with a product, solving a problem, they build a great brand, and maybe they think about the community as a byproduct. But we've literally gone the opposite direction, much like many other open source companies have, like MongoDB is a good example. So I think that that's probably the second learning, is that there's no one size fits all. It sort of depends on what you're trying to solve.
Fascinating. You mentioned one of the things around building with the community. Looks like there are people who really are helpers. They just get the dopamine in coming and responding to stuff. How do you look at those people who are probably not responding, but mostly coming and getting from the community rather than giving back to the community? How do they get the dopamine to keep coming back to the platform?
Right. I think it's if you think about what people are trying to accomplish. So dopamine hits. It's interesting because we're not necessarily a social network, but at the same time, we are very collaborative in the way we share information, right? So it comes down actually there to the point around the DNA of the person, right? I think ultimately, I think inherently developers and technologists, to the earlier point around, I think they empathize with the fact that, hey, this is a common bug. I don't want you to spend 12 hours trying to debug it yourself. Let me help you out. I think that DNA exists for a developer in general, right? Or a software developer in general. So I think it's that, along with the added benefit of getting sort of recognized as somebody who is contributing to somebody else's success. I think those are all, I think, very positive things. And so whether that's explicit recognition or implicitly you're feeling the alignment of heart and mind that you've actually done a good thing for the day, I think is probably the reasons why people are sort of ultimately contributing, because they want to be part of the community inherently. And then of course on the receiving end, like we talked about, I think people obviously have an issue, they go to a Google search, land on Stack Overflow, get the answer, and it's part of their workflow. And of course, that's a dopamine hit in its own, because you're able to solve the problem very instantaneously with the power of
you use the word search, and I was actually going to ask you about engagement, but before I get to engagement, I want to understand, like, what makes search click at Stack Overflow? Like, do you have to work very collaboratively with Google search engine and other search engines to really bring a lot of these things to the fore? What role does a popular search engine play to really surface up the stuff that people are looking for?
Yeah, I would say overall, we don't necessarily work with the search engines to kind of optimize for that necessarily. I think we do a lot of, ultimately the core answer is we want to make sure that the content is accurate and up to date and relevant for people that are trying to find an answer, right? So there's this organic part, which is there's obviously like a performance element to the site and making sure that it returns with a certain sort of speed and so on. And I think those things, the team has spent a lot of time, over a decade optimizing, and there's been a lot of focus on making sure the results are very quick and so on. But then, of course, it's the content. Like, is it right or wrong? So that's the power of the platform that is sort of sort of moderating in a way to make sure that the community is making sure the right answers are always on the top. And we also have new initiatives to make sure that outdated questions are taken care of, and or outdated answers are updated with new technologies and so on, or new, better alternatives. So all those things, pruning of the content and that self-regulation, which ultimately makes sure that you're always getting the right answer, and it is well recognized because the voting system basically promotes it in terms of the number of views. And we even track, for example, one question has been, if you go to Stack Overflow, we know this question has been accessed 10 million times since it was actually asked, and this answer has helped so many people. And so the fact that it's getting so many hits because it's a popular question and it's relevant in the context of the problem that's been solved is really the fundamental reason why it ultimately does rank high on the search results, because that is the purpose of search results, right? To make sure that the most relevant question is answered up top. So
yeah. I mean, you've already been sort of delving into this notion of engagement, but maybe there's an explicit way you define engagement in a community. Like, what makes a community engaged? And you, when you look at yourself as a community creator or a maintainer or a custodian of the community, how do you measure what's going on in terms of engagement?
Yeah, there's a lot that we think about with regards to metrics. It's we have two strategic priorities and three foundations. And one of the foundations of the company is always community health and growth. So we always think about that as one of the things we focus on. We review it every month as a team and monthly business reviews and so on. And it has to do with there are quality metrics, and then there are obviously sort of the traditional community metrics. So I'll give you some kind of a small sampling, right? So everything from when you think about just page views and MAUs and MEUs, MUVs, all these sort of unique visitors, active users, engaged users. There's also, for example, we think about moderator satisfaction. So we track that to make sure that we are actually, when I mentioned building with the community for the community, our job is to enable those moderators to be successful by giving them a lot of tools that they can use and so on. So we poll the moderator community every quarter And it's been quite high of late because we've actually focused on that subject very specifically. And so those are a couple of dimensions. Of course, there are things like operational SLAs that you'd expect, content health indicator scores to make sure that the content that's out there is not outdated. So those are some of the broader things. And they're also a little bit, we're also now getting, when we think about how to make our community more inclusive and more welcoming for even more novice programmers versus sort of the professional folks, we do think about, we've not yet measured this yet, but in the context of, we do surveys and so on, so we get measurements to that. But really, we're trying to make sure that we change the way in which we approach things like untoward comments or their sharp comments to a beginner. We rolled out something called the unfriendly robot that goes and skims for any sort of harsh comments and so on. So we're beginning to use more and more tools and automation to sort of help with us. So that's a combination. That's an answer to suggest we've got metrics for sure that we measure, and then there are initiatives that obviously back those metrics ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, while you were talking, I was just thinking about what Vinod had to say just in the last talk about the human element of AI and what does that do in terms of implications to jobs and things like that.
Right.
I've been hearing about some element of elitism with respect to the experts in the community, in places like Stack Overflow, and how when novices come on board,
right,
there's a little bit of this dread about, am I doing the right thing, and how do I get accepted here, and are people really harsh about a simple question that might have been answered a number of times?
Yeah.
How do you think this is going to evolve in the coming 3 to 5 years? Because obviously people are getting more and more busy, and they feel like people should do their homework, and there's different cultural aspects to this as well. So are you folks thinking about this, and does it keep you awake sometimes?
Yeah, it's certainly, I think it's a very it's an opportunity and something that needs to be very thought through to be able to sort of fully sort of leverage the capabilities. It's a boon that we have ML tools, and this AI is now sort of at the forefront. But there's a lot to do with, we collect a lot of data, right? Like in terms of structured data and unstructured data, whether that's, number of people that have logged in or questions that have been asked and those sort of things. But then also all the freeform stuff, where we've got people asking questions, answering it, exactly, how people have sort of, they've searched for a particular term, they've looked at question 1, 2, 3, they've copied this from question 3, they've now posted a new question X minutes later. So it gives us we've got a lot of great insight into how people sort of think about solving problems, and how they're looking to learn ultimately on how they're trying to like code and so on. So that is an opportunity more broadly, and I think that all of that I think publicly people have access to about a terabyte of data, something like that, and then we have something like I think 70 terabytes that we can sort of all the things I just mentioned we can go and help people with. And the unfriendly robot is an attempt to make sure that we are when it does come to this is fine balance, right? The urge, which is to make sure that you get the right answer. There's always going to be a wrong answer. So the platform has worked for the past 13 years because it is objective in that nature. Now, with that comes a right and wrong answer to an objective software-development question. Because this is not a social network, this is not an opinion-based network, this is a fact-based thing. But at the same time, how do you make sure that you have softer landing zones for people that are just beginning to sort of participate in our platform? So we are absolutely thinking about places for them to sort of get feedback or get trained or onboard in a safe way, or in a more friendly way, I should say, before they sort of jump into the deep end of the pool with Stack as an example, right? And at the same time, do automation things like the unfriendly robot, like I mentioned, to sort of just make sure that is more of we're just doing that holistically to minimize that sort of sharpness and tone in the community. So it's a balance, because there's objectivity associated with it, as well as you have to also try to welcome the next generation of coders.
Yeah, like most things in life, it's a paradox,
Yeah.
I want to go back to one of your observations about going from community building to product building now. And maybe we can fork this question. These are two different questions. One is, how is your product evolving as you look at the large enterprise and you think of monetization at large? How are you thinking about the product? And maybe you can talk about your go-to-market as well. What
Sure.
does zero touch mean? What does low touch mean?
Mm.
And how are you thinking about high touch versus low touch versus zero touch?
Right. Yeah. Happy to. I think so. A couple of things, right? So in terms of the community, the stage that we're at right now is that we're on this product-led journey. Ironically, when you build a community platform like Stack Overflow, which serves 100 million people, it's effectively built for an enterprise-grade sort of application, right? Because you're working with a lot of users. So interestingly, at Stack, when we launched the SaaS version of Stack Overflow, which is Stack Overflow for Teams in 2017, which is now used by all the big enterprises in the world, you've got, with Microsoft as an example, has 100,000 users on our platform, right? Or all the big financial services institutions have tens of thousands of users on our platform, SaaS platform. It was ironically launched first in the enterprise, and you having built great companies like Nutanix, that most companies start perhaps on the SMB, move to mid-market, then move to enterprise. We literally started the opposite. Because the platform was so effective to serve so many people, it was very relevant for a large enterprise. And now, only the past couple of years, and after our new team has come on board and all that, we are now moving more down market, actually, to continue to expand the aperture. And only this year, we launched our freemium offering for Stack Overflow for Teams, right? So which would be literally the opposite of what people would do when you start in your product journey. And that's no different from us starting with the community and moving to a product journey. It's almost, so everything we've done is somewhat in reverse, but it's almost like it's filling the gaps of things that you would want to fill out. But we've started from our vantage point or strength, or kind of our point of strength rather, because we're operating, at scale at the enterprise level. So that's the first part of that, and so hopefully that answers the question. You had a second part to your question. Sorry.
Which is like, how is the product evolving? When you think of
Sure,
productizing more of what the last 13 years of lessons have been. How's the evolution coming along?
Yeah, I think that, two things I'd mentioned. One is I think there's one we've done well over the past couple of years, in my opinion, is that previously it was sort of this community here on this corner, and you had all the paid products on the other side of the house, right? And the reality is that they're all serving the same people. So like having one unified product strategy and an ecosystem of products, as our product leader would say, that is the way we've sort of approached it. So we've evolved it from saying, listen, there's kind of this public utility and there's kind of the business on the side making money, to saying, listen, it's all one. It's an extension of the public platform, and the SaaS product is an extension of the fact that you're using Stack Overflow today in the context of getting a question on Python. But if 60% of what you want to share and collaborate with your peer is confidential or proprietary to your company, then here's a private version of it. So that's an extension to the same user, right? Similarly, on the advertising side, which we call reach and relevance, it's about helping those developers connect with great technology companies to try out their products and get engaged in more sub-communities and get exposure to new launches and all those sort of things. Again, it's serving the same user. And of course, there's a sort of two sides to that marketplace. There's the enterprise and the companies trying to sort of promote their stuff and their companies to these developers. So I would say that so point number one is a unification of that strategy, I think, has been a big evolution. And then point number two is that we've sort of, in this world of where there's a lot of convergence of cloud transformation, access to data, AI. There's obviously the supply-demand imbalance with technology talent versus who's available to go do all this work at companies that want to accelerate faster. All those things, and by the way, not to mention probably one of the most important things, we're all going to be living in a hybrid world for a long time. All of that, when you put it all together, our product is sort of very well positioned to address that, because we're thinking about the world as sort of synchronous collaboration and asynchronous collaboration, and we play in the asynchronous collaboration world to help people share knowledge in a very collaborative fashion. So a lot of what we're doing is to create connective tissue with things like Slack and Microsoft Teams, so that when you're in a conversation that's synchronous, how do you make sure you capture that knowledge and place it for the next person who's asking the same question, that somebody doesn't have to bother you on Slack again. It's in Stack Overflow for Teams. So our product is much more evolving into a new age version of knowledge sharing and collaboration versus the old way of knowledge management with wikis and Confluence and all those sort of things more broadly. So those are probably two things I'd mention.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. In fact, you talked about hybrid and also for teams. When we spoke last, you also talked about how there's a private version of communities that people want to, really go and index their code and talk about it in a more sort of their walled garden as opposed to come to a public place to do so, especially for large enterprise.
Right.
How are you mixing and matching that private experience with the public experience? And are these going to be two separate worlds, or do you think there's a way that you could bring them together for these customers?
Yeah, no, great question. I think we, as the foundation of that unified product strategy that I explained previously, gives us the optionality to sort of think of this as sort of a modular type of set of things, right? So across both private and public. So, back in the day when we were talking about object-oriented programming, this is no different. It's like it is specifically to say, how do we take components that we build in the private experience and port that over to the public experience, and vice versa. So, the first big port, of course, was, hey, the public experience is to make a private version of that. And that's effectively what people have access to internally. But now we've launched things that a very specific example is we launched something called articles, which is long form content, very different from Q&A that Stack Overflow is well known for in the private experience, Stack Overflow for Teams. And very recently, when we launched in the public platform a new product called Collectives on Stack Overflow, which allows big tech companies like Google Cloud or GitLab or Go language, et cetera, like open source communities to build their own sub-communities with their own walled garden, so to speak. We've now introduced articles from the private version into this Collectives product in the public community. And so we're mixing and matching. We have the optionality to do it where there is a use case to use it, but these components are being built for multiple sort of use, which I think is powerful at the end of the day. Now, it requires a lot of coordination because when you're working with 100 million people, any change to the ecosystem, it's kind of like a rainforest, right? You can't just sort of like toss a bunch of stuff and just change the sort of the balance. So like there's a lot of coordination to make sure that you're introducing it in a very thoughtful way, you're taking a lot of feedback and input, and that's always a balance to do it.
Fascinating. One of the other things that we think about as a company is, how do you bring a micro experience of search, for example, within the app, and it could be like bringing the community to the app rather than having yet another place where you go to. What do you think of the word headless when it comes to community? Like, is it possible to create micro experiences that are more, sort of context driven within the app itself rather than having to go outside the app and do something on the side?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's an interesting topic. I mean, it certainly feels, I think it would be interesting if we can solve the problem. It's a tough problem to solve, in my opinion, because we're dealing with a lot of data, right? And there's a lot of, in general, there are a few platforms where you can probably do that, I guess is my point, I would say, right? So that's one of the thinking of behind even something like Collectives is we've got at Stack Overflow, we've got this massive amounts of traffic, 100 million people. So if companies try to create their own version of that, like try to do it from scratch, it is quite a task to do because you have to, again, bring people together for a common purpose and all those things that I explained. However, if you piggyback off the place where people are going anyways to get their answers, then that's a powerful thing to do. So I think it's hard to basically, I think with certain exceptions, like, for example, I mentioned MongoDB previously, but even MongoDB has a massive presence on Stack Overflow, right? Like, so the question is, I think you want to stay interconnected. The whole point of breaking down silos is to actually go across and break down silos and not really create barriers for knowledge sharing. And so at a principle, at the highest level, Dheeraj, I'm answering your question, is that, giving more interconnected, creating more interconnected tissue is probably the way to go than not, in my opinion, right? So actually reaching across would probably be the better way to do it.
So would you then leave that problem for Google crawlers to go crawl and then bring this together? Or would you have your crawlers that, for example, go to a MongoDB community and get a lot of that index in your side?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it sort of depends on what you're trying to solve for, how big you are as a company and a presence and so on. In our case, for example, because again, our vantage point is like this, there's a very broad sort of space. So we believe we've got sort of the knowledge on every possible technology topic. That being said, there's other content that's out there as well that's relevant. For example, when Google Cloud launched its community on top of Stack Overflow and our Collectives product, which has 250,000 questions and answers in our collective, right? It has, I think, like 10,000 people that have joined that collective now since we launched it just a couple of months ago. You can see it on our website. But they also have their own private, they also have their own community at Google Cloud. And the reality is that people are, it's all about the workflow, right? In terms of how people are accessing information. So if people are coming to Stack anyways, great, you have access to that workflow as people engage on Google Cloud, and they can engage on that topic. But people are also going to Google Cloud directly to get their answers to questions that are somewhat relevant to them there. So so yes, I think it has to sort of, it's depending on the size, it can exist in both places. And we're less connected, we're not trying to be restrictive on that topic. We want to be as sort of as expansive, because ultimately our mission is to make sure that knowledge is freely shared across the board. So
knowledge is being shared. Great way to come to the last question, Prashanth. It's always fun to talk to you and learn from you on community building. High level, what is like 2 or 3 things that you'd give out as an advice to anybody building a community, including the one that we're trying to build at DevRev now? Very, very fledgling right now, but want to be able to go and build something that can take a leaf out of the book that Stack Overflow really wrote.
Yeah, I think that I mentioned those 5 things earlier on, right? Whether that's shared identity and incentivizing and rewarding users, building with the community versus for the community, breaking down those silos and those bridges, building bridges across, and then ultimately creating those virtuous cycles. Beyond those principles, I'd say that probably one of the most important things that we have learned is really for building great communities is really truly listening. It takes a very specific skill to put aside and be very objective, put aside your personal sort of view of the world, to really understand and empathize with the user and to understand what's working and what's not working. And that's a constant sort of effort. It takes a lot of work. We have entire community management team. We have a significant product investment around that area. And we also have created a lot of infrastructure for enabling that listening. So that's moderator councils or the meta community or surveys that we perform, as I mentioned previously, or this moderator satisfaction scores to make sure that we're constantly improving. And ultimately, it's also really important, I believe, to experiment and test various things, because the world is evolving, to your point, very rapidly. And while some assumptions may operate in certain environments, they don't operate when you're evolving as the world is evolving, as younger and younger coders are coming on to sort of learn, right? Like, how do you make sure that is the next generation? So the question that you can't just sort of say, listen, this is going to be only for the expert programmers. So I think being open to evolution and testing, I think, is the sort of the other piece. And then probably my final thing I would just say is, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Ultimately, your intentions are what matter, because ultimately you're trying to do the right thing when you're working with the community. But it is going to be one where there's a balance, where you're going to be interacting with a lot of people. It is inevitable to make some number of mistakes as you try out new things. But the only way to do it is to try. But make your intent very, very clear before you try, and explain the why before you do it. So those are probably some learnings.
Very clear. Yeah, I think with that, we end on that note. Be authentic with our community. Build with them, not for them. Prashanth, Chandrasekar, always a pleasure. Thank you again for coming on board, and look forward to learning with you and from you.
Okay. Same here. Thank you, and all the best with your new venture. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, bye.